Today we'll be dealing with changing rural landscape and environment in India under colonial rule. This lecture will be divided into 4 sections. First is the introductory part, then we have the background, then we have the impact of British colonial rule on the forest, on the environment of India. And here we have 3 subsections. One is how the British utilized Indian teak wood to serve the British Navy. That is one. Second is a huge land grab movement in India in order to meet the revenue demands which denuded the forests. And third is the building of the railway tracks, railway sleepers from the mid-19th century when there was large-scale deforestation. And then we will make a brief summing up. In the recent period, as some of you must know, ecological history has become an important subject of study, particularly the history of British India, the advent of British rule in India, its impact on Indian environment, Indian ecology. And the interesting point is that there is an intimate connection between Western imperialism and environmental degradation. Some people say that Western capitalism is something very progressive, it is an advancement. But the fact is that whenever Western capitalism grew and it expanded into the colonies, its colonial network, it brought about environmental degradation, just the opposite. And this has been proved by recent researches in many countries. In fact, world ecology was disturbed first by trade and then by colonialism. And such aggressive interventions by the capitalist countries brought 2 things. The first was the virtual reshaping of the social, ecological, and demographic characteristics of the land, of the habitats they intruded upon. The other is that they ensured that the changes were for their own benefit, not for the benefit of the people who became victims, but for the benefit of Europe. If we consider the Indian landscape and environment, it can be seen that these changed drastically during colonial rule to the advantage of Britain and to the disadvantage of India. India, as we all know, is a vast subcontinent. It used to be a green land that was interspersed by habitations, patches of habitations, and few arid areas when India was independent. Now, there were big forests, there were woods, there were smaller forests, jungles. Now, all these, along with other things, rivers, mountains, etc. Now, all these form an integral part of Indian landscape. If we refer to the situation in ancient India, we can say that whenever people traveled from one part to another, they had to travel through forests when they went from one Janapadu to another. Writers on ancient Indian history, Romila Thapar, Didi Kosambi, and many others, they have observed that there was so much forested land in the country, in the countryside, that there existed no fear of the disappearance of the forests. They were lying in abundance, and they were expected to lie in abundance throughout. As writers point out, forest villages were there in ancient India, which were well stocked with rice, and there were a large number of forest dwellers, tribal people in different parts of the countryside. And it was the forest products mainly which provided them sustenance. A large number of tribal people, they used to reside in and around the forest, inside the forests or in areas very near the jungles. And their whole livelihood was very much tied up with the forest world. Forest became an integral part of their life. They can never think of isolating themselves from the forest. There was nobody could think of the depletion of forest resources, despite the fact that forest products were used and trees were cut down for use as fuel. All these things became possible because in the pre-colonial times there was hardly any state control over forest, in the sense that there were no state-imposed restrictions on the use of forest resources. Yes, theoretically the state or the government, they controlled the forests. They were the owners of the forest. State is the owner of the forest, okay. But people were there who used the forest produce, and they had been using this for generations, for centuries together. And in the long period from the Maurya rule to the Mughal rule, state control over the forests was restricted in its application and oriented towards highly specific ends, for this reason or that reason. And without any restrictions of their habitations, tribals were free to reside, to depend on forest products, to kill forest animals for food, for their subsistence. As we have pointed out, in this way they had developed their own cultural life in the heart of nature. Now, that was the situation when India was independent, when India was free, and when India was not colonized by any foreign power. But the whole situation changed after the advent of colonial rule, after the advent of British rule. We all know that the colonial conquest of India began with the Battle of Plassey in 1757. British victory in the Battle of Plassey ushered in significant changes in every aspect of the economy, in politics and society of the country. That was followed by the granting of the Diwani to the East India Company by the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II in 1765. The West India Company started to pursue a policy of extraction of the maximum quantity of revenue. That was their policy. They realized, quite rightly, that that could be done only through the resumption of more and more land. And as years went by, this turned out to be a land grab movement of a very aggressive nature. So the land grab movement by the state started mainly when India was under colonial rule. It is well known that the most tangible outcome of colonial rule, in fact the effects of which persist even today, is related to its global control over resources. Capitalism, imperialism always seeks to exercise its control over the resources of all the countries. It has been pointed out by scholars who have done much work on history of environment, such as Madhav Gadgil or Ramchandra Guha, that the Europeans could not create neo-Europes by decimating the indigenous population. European colonies, neo-Europes meaning European colonies, that they did not do. But what they did is that they did intervene and radically alter the existing food production systems and their ecological basis. That they did. And in India, the political victory of the British enabled them to make an unprecedented intervention in the ecological and social fabric of Indian society. And side by side, they also influenced, or they also seduced their Indian subjects towards the industrial economy of Britain. And by doing so, since they became so much influenced by the Western model, by the Western capitalist model, the British also ensured that the process of ecological change they initiated would continue and even intensify after they departed from this country. So the policy continued even after 1947, when direct colonial rule came to an end. The first thing is that Indian teakwood was utilized to build the British Navy for military purposes. In fact, by around 1860, Britain had emerged or starting to emerge not only as the leader of the capitalist world, but also as the world leader of deforestation, devastating its own woods first, that is in its own country, and the forests of Ireland, South Africa, northeastern United States, and they drew timber from those countries for shipbuilding, for iron smelting and farming. And on some occasions, the destruction of the forest was used by them to symbolize their victory, political victory, whenever they defeated any adversary. After the defeat of the adversary, they simply destroyed the forests. It was burned down, and there was total destruction of large forest areas. Thus, in the early 19th century, and following its defeat of the Marathas, the East India Company razed to the ground teak plantations in Ratnagiri, which was nurtured and grown by the legendary Maratha admiral Kanhoji Angre. And their early treatment of the Indian forests also reinforces the claim that, quote, the destructive energy of the British race all over the world, unquote, was rapidly converting the forest into deserts. With oak forests vanishing in England, a permanent supply of durable timber was needed for the Royal Navy, for the British Navy. And since there was no teak wood in Britain, so teak wood would have to be plundered from other areas, so they looked towards the colonies. They looked towards India. And in fact, it was Indian teak wood which was the most durable of shipbuilding timbers. And it was Indian teak which saved England during the war with Napoleon and later maritime expansion. So British Navy depended to a large extent on Indian teak after the British rulers denuded their own resources in their own country. You know that there was a great demand for revenue, land revenue. 3 settlements were made, and all these land settlements in 3 different regions were related to land. And since there were many forest lands were not cultivable lands, it had to be made cultivable, and so destroy the forests, convert the forest lands into arable lands. So it means denuding of the forests. And that was one of the major policies of the colonial rulers, denuding of the forests. Their removal added to the class of land assessed for revenue. Ironically, it was said, some people said, that forests are an obstruction to agriculture and consequently a bar to the prosperity of the empire. Forests obstructed agriculture. Yes, it did obstruct agriculture. And it was a bar to the prosperity of the empire. So destroy the forests to bring more and more land under the soil and employ people, sharecroppers and others, exploit them to the vast extent possible, and to draw surplus, so that and siphon off that surplus to the metropolis. You know that railway lines were being constructed from the mid 19th century. So it started a bit earlier. Actually, the move for the construction of the railway lines in a big way started after the revolt of 1857-58. You know that the revolt of 1857-58 proved that because of the lack of communication network, there could not be any movement of troops. That was a military consideration. There were other considerations also. And so it was felt that railway network be set up, be constructed, which could politically unify the country by building up a strong, very powerful communication network. It started generally from the mid-19th century. Now, what is needed primarily for the construction of the railway lines is wooden sleepers for the railway lines. And so great chunks of forests were destroyed to meet the demand for railway sleepers, and there was virtually no supervision over the felling operations. As a matter of fact, a large number of trees were felled and lay rotting on the ground. Many scholars have done researches on various aspects dealing with environment, and they have pointed out that total wastage, in one sense, is a wastage of forest resources. And the sub-Himalayan forests of Garhwal and Kumaon region were all felled, which were never removed. It was felled on the ground, and those remained there, never utilized for any purpose. And here we have both private contractors. Both Indian and foreign, both private contractors, and they were responsible for this destruction. And the forests of the Indian chiefs also could not escape their hands. Another point that needs attention is that before the coal mines of Raniganj became fully operative, yes, coal was essential for running the railways. And when before the introduction of coal, before the colonial rulers could ensure a regular supply of coal from Raniganj, they depended also on timber for fuel. So Indian timber was used both for making sleepers as also as fuel for running the railways, running the engines. Before coal came in, it was in the interest of the British that railway lines were constructed, and it was in the interest of the British that forest resources were destroyed ruthlessly, very aggressively. Now, one of the most vivid descriptions of the transformation in the ecological landscape wrought by the railways is found in a book by Cleghorn, which is captioned "The Forests and Gardens of South India." Cleghorn writes that the Melghat and North Arcot hills, formerly crowned with timber, were now to a considerable degree laid bare by the insatiable demand of the railways. All around the tracks, where once there were forests, there now lay wide swaths of cleared land, stripped bare of cover and consequently of protection to wild animals. So wild animals, they also got protection from the forests. So they were affected. So it affected forest life also, not that the tribal people, but also the animals. And there are animals are also, they also lay in abundance. There were many animals, wild animals in the Indian jungles which were affected because they couldn't get the protective cover supplied. That could be supplied only by the forests. In the Madras Presidency, over 250,000 sleepers of 35,000 trees were required annually from indigenous sources. And to meet this demand, the contractors resorted to more and more exploitation. Side by side, they cleared jungles farther and farther away from the railway lines. They intruded into the interior. And at the same time, they also utilized more and more unsuitable species for the purpose. All timber are not suitable for the building of the railway sleepers. As a result of this greed for more and more profit, for hunger, lust for profit, they started to utilize more unsuitable species. And in fact, only half a dozen species were considered suitable for use as railway sleepers. But more than 50 were tried out. Since these were unsuitable for this purpose, there is no surprise that sleepers which are expected to last 5 or 6 years only lasted just a third of the time. If we consider the pace of the railway construction, We have some data. In 1860, there were 1,349 kilometers of railway track. In 1910, that is after 50 years, it increased to 51,658. And of course, it left in its wake a trail of destruction, and which clearly proved that India's forest resources were not at all inexhaustible. And Cleghorn pointed out in his book that railway requirements were the first and by far the most formidable of the forces that led to the thinning out of the Indian forests. After some time, the government felt the necessity to ensure the sustained availability of enormous requirements of the different railway companies for sleepers. And it was this realization that made the subject of forest conservancy an important administrative question. In order to get greater access to commercially profitable timber, the colonial government formed the Forest Department in 1864, and it passed the Forest Act in 1865 in order to assert the state monopoly over it. In August 1864, the government of Bengal appointed T. Anderson as a conservator of forests. In December 1864, under wasteland rules, all forests above 6,000 feet in the Darjeeling area were declared reserved. That was followed by the reservation of many areas of Assam as reserved. With the entry of the colonial state in the Indian forests, the process of marginalization of the forest-based tribal people became more and more vigorous. They became marginalized. In the Chotanagpur region, rules were promulgated restricting resin or gum tapping from shal trees. They depended on this for their livelihood to a large extent, so that was restricted by official intervention. In order to justify its control over forests, the colonial government advocated forest conservation and did another thing, which also hit the tribal people, the people living in the hilly region. They launched a vigorous attack on the age-old jhum cultivation or shifting cultivation, because their argument was that it was doing ecological damage. Jhum cultivation or shifting cultivation was doing ecological damage. And in fact, it was through the Indian Forest Act of 1878 that the colonial government started to establish complete control over the forests, state control. It was not there in the pre-colonial period when India was independent. It came when India became dependent, when India became a colony. And it also at the same time deprived the forest-based tribal people from enjoying their age-old right of free access to forest and use of the forest products. The colonialists started to take under their control vast foreign tracts by declaring them as reserve forests. So forests became reserved and imposed numerous restrictions on the age-old existing forest use. In 1876, the government created a reserve forest in the Dumka district of the Santal Parganas, which directly affected 48 Paharia villages dependent on that forest, solely on that forest for their livelihood. And this is true of other areas as well. And in fact, the process of direct British capitalist penetration into the forests continued later. In 1914-15, negotiations were made with Barn and Company for the extraction of bamboos from one of the Chittagong hill tracts, reserve forests, and concessions were granted to Shaw Wallace for the collection of nettle fiber from certain plants in the Darjeeling reserves. Bamboo was important for paper, for the production of paper, when paper mills were set up. Bali paper mill, Chittagong paper mill in the second half of the 19th century, all owned by the foreigners, British-owned mills. They made experiments, and bamboo was one of the important ingredients. So these were needed. So it was also needed for industrial purposes to suit their requirements. In 1921-22, the Buxa Timber and Trading Company had been given 120 square miles of Buxa Reserve for 33 years to extract timber for the manufacture of tea chests, tea boxes, tea chests. And Andrew Ewell and Company started to work in the Chittagong hill tracts to extract bamboo for paper pulp manufacture. What we find is that with the introduction of the Forest Department with Forest Conservation Agenda, there took place a massive increase in the extraction of forest products, total depletion of forest resources. And throughout the early 19th century, the East India Company's government regularly collected timber and exported lac and other forest products from the forests of eastern India. The foundation of the Forest Department only further systematized the whole process. And as a result of this, the sons of the soil, the Adivasi people, the common people, the basic masses, they were thrown out of their places, their land and their habitats, and were left to die out of starvation in hundreds, in thousands, in many, many times more. In the whole process, the colonial rulers were helped by the domestic agencies, by their domestic collaborators.